As was stated, the title of this course primarily is The Life of the Messiah, with the subtitle From a Jewish Perspective. Now, generally speaking, in most Christian schools where there happen to be a Bible Institute or a Bible college or a seminary, whenever the professor textbook begins to deal with the historical backgrounds of the Gospels and New Testament studies, they invariably deal only with the Greek and Roman backgrounds. That's very helpful for certain segments of the New Testament, like the latter part of Acts, like Corinthians, Ephesians, Galatians, and so on. The life of Jesus does not play itself out within the framework of a Greek or Roman culture, but a Jewish culture, and a very specific type of Jewish culture, that of first century Israel. And so throughout the four Gospels, things are said the way they are said, things happen the way they happen, they're written the way they're written because of a specific Jewish frame of reference, a Jewish background. The knowledge of that Jewish background was always available, was never lost. But about the 4th century, the larger church simply chose to ignore it. As a result, as church history developed, different divisions occurred, church wars were fought, denominations split, and so on, over phrases like to be born of water. Now we'll see in this study that being born of water has very specific Jewish meaning. But somebody somewhere back then forgot to ask a Jew what it meant, and we have suddenly had a brand new denomination based upon that one phrase alone. And so in this study, as we survey all four Gospels using A.T. Robertson's Harmony, we're going to specifically focus on the Jewish frame of reference to get a better understanding of what these passages are dealing with. Now, two things relevant to this course that you will be good for you to have. First of all is a copy of A.T. Robertson's Harmony of the Gospels. The advantage of this is that he has the parallel Gospels in column form, so that I don't have to keep flipping back and forth between the Gospels. It's all on the same page. And the second thing you need is this particular outline I put together that is based upon A.T. Robertson's Harmony, and we'll be going through this in that manner. Another thing to know by way of introductory material for now is there are two basic ways to approach the life of the Messiah. A more common way to approach is what we call the geographical approach. In the geographical approach, they simply, after the birth narratives, they go and divide his life into various divisions of the land where he was. So you'll read about the greater Galilean ministry, the later Perean ministry, the later Galilean, early Judean, later Judean, Jerusalem, and so on. And that is a valid way to approach his life, but the limitations of that approach is that what you have is a series of events or teachings individually before you get to his final week when the atonement was made. And what you fail to see is the correlation of one event to another, one teaching to another. And A.T. Robertson, when he put this harmony together, uses that same geographical approach. If you look at his outline, say in Roman numeral page 11, he talks about the beginning of the Poly ministry, the great Galilean ministry, the ministry around the districts of Galilee, Judean ministry, Perean ministry, Jerusalem ministry, and so on. So he put his harmony together based upon the geographical approach to the life of the Messiah. Now, I've given you a different outline that's based upon a thematic approach. The thematic theme we're dealing with is called Jesus the Messianic King. Jesus the Messianic King. And after the two introductory points of material, we divide his life into 10 divisions. And in this outline, you have the 10-part division used upon Roman numerals. And then as we go through it that way, we'll see the correlation between one event, one teaching, and so on. So and if you look at the board, what you'll see is that the outline is divided into 10 main divisions, major life divisions. There'll be 10 divisions. And then you will have subdivisions, the capital A's, and then the subdivisions, so one, then small a, and so on, following the normal outline format. And the outline doesn't give you verses, it gives you paragraph numbers. and the paragraph numbers are based upon the paragraph divisions of A.T. Robertson's Harmony. And so when I make references, I'll say paragraph 1, paragraph 2, paragraph 3, and that's the way we'll be following things. Now, periodically at the upper left-hand corner, you'll see a number, because Ariel Ministries has produced about 190-some manuscripts, and a lot of these have to do with Life of Messiah, about, let's say, at least a third, if not more, the material covering in these 3 weekends is in manuscript form. And so if you're interested in pursuing it in manuscript study, you can jot down the numerical number for that area, and then you can get the material from Ariel Ministries. Now, with this introduction, let's go ahead and begin by turning to the first paragraph, which covers Luke chapter 1, verses 1 through 4. And here we have on your outline the first of 2 points of introductory material, which is Luke's prologue, which he provides us with the source of knowledge. Now let's try to envision a circle. And inside the circle is everything that Jesus ever said or did. Yeshua, that you see on here, would be his Hebrew name. But everything he ever did, everything he ever said from the moment he was conceived until his ascension is within this circle. As John points out at the end of his gospel, it would have been impossible for anyone to be able to sit down and write down everything that Jesus said or taught. John says the world could not contain the books that would then need to be written. So we have to note is that the 4 gospel writers were selective as to what they chose to report. And what they chose to report and what they chose to leave out was based upon their own individual themes. And while the main theme running through all 4 gospels is Jesus the Messianic King, at the same time they each have their own separate individual themes that we'll mention. For example, we have Matthew coming along, and Matthew has a specific theme, and so he looks inside the circle and looks at event A. And event A does somehow portray the point he wants to make, and so he does record it into his account. He then looks at event B, and B doesn't really do anything for what Matthew wants to develop, and so he simply chooses not to report on event B, and that's left out of his gospel. He looks at event C, and like event A, C also portrays what he wants to show in his gospel, and he does add that to his gospel. So Matthew, you have A and C recorded. Then Mark comes along, and he has a different theme he wants to record. He looks at the event A, and while event A was helpful for Matthew, it's not helpful for Mark, so Mark chose to ignore event A that Matthew recorded. He looks at the event B, and while B was not helpful to Matthew, it is helpful to Mark, and so Mark takes B and records it into his gospel. Then he looks at the event C, and while C was helpful to Matthew, also happens to be helpful to Mark, and so he also records C into his gospel. And while both Matthew and Mark report the event C, the way they choose to record it and the way they report on it will be a bit different based upon the theme they want to develop. They never contradict each other. They simply fill in different blanks that the writer simply chose to leave out because it was not helpful to the theme they were trying to develop. But again, the gospel writers all have to be somewhat selective as to what they would choose to record and not record. Now, with that background, let's talk about the different themes of each gospel, and we'll begin with the theme of Matthew. Matthew's theme is Yeshua, Jesus the Messiah, the King of the Jews. And Matthew's gospel is written specifically to a Jewish audience. Now, these Gospels written to meet specific needs of specific peoples, and because the first believers were all Jewish believers, it'd be natural for the first need to arise among Jewish believers to have such a gospel. As we know from the book of Acts, initially the Messianic community stayed in Jerusalem and had direct access to the apostles. And so if they wished to know what did Jesus say about this or that, then the apostle could tell them because of first-hand knowledge. But the stoning of Stephen in Acts 7, that caused a dispersion of the Messianic community in Acts chapter 8. And while the apostles remained in Jerusalem, many of the sheep were now scattered in different parts of the Middle East, going into Syria, going into what is now Lebanon, and so on. And so they needed to have an authoritative source for the life of the Messiah, and Matthew provides them with that issue. Now, Matthew writes with a specific theme, and his theme, as I mentioned, is Jesus the Messiah, the King of the Jews. And he has to explain why if Jesus really was the Messiah, why was not the kingdom set up? That's the very same objection you'll hear among Jewish people today when you witness to them. If Jesus was the Messiah, where is the Messianic kingdom? Where is world peace? In fact, I point out we've had more wars since he came than before he came. And so Matthew has to explain why the Messianic kingdom was not set up at this point of time. And he will especially trace in as much detail as he can the Messianic program and the Messianic kingdom program, and explaining why Jesus is still the Messiah, although the Messianic kingdom was not set up at that point of time. And so his purpose to show that Jesus was that Messianic king, to show why the kingdom was not set up, to explain the kingdom program. He also writes in light of impending judgment. The judgment of AD 70 was coming out soon, a judgment Jesus predicted on more than one occasion, and so he's writing to give them the necessary warnings about this coming impending judgment. Now we come to Mark, and Mark's theme is Jesus the Messiah, the servant of Jehovah, and Mark writes for the Romans. Now in the Roman culture of that day, the ideal Roman was someone who could receive a command and quickly carry it out and come back and say the mission was accomplished. And so since writing to Romans, Mark presents Jesus as the ideal servant, one who receives a commission and he quickly carries the commission out. Over 40 times uses a Greek word that is translated either as straight away, immediately, or forthwith. Straight away, immediately, or forthwith. Over 40 times there's a sense of urgency to get the mission done. And while he's presenting Jesus in a way that would communicate the Roman mindset of that day, he does not fail to deal with the Jewish background. And in the background that he bases this concept on is the servant of Jehovah passages of the prophet Isaiah. Isaiah's favorite title for the Messiah was the servant of Jehovah, or the servant of the Lord. And using that motif and quoting it at certain times, like Isaiah 53, he presents Jesus, the ideal servant, carrying out the mission that he was called upon to perform. Now Luke's theme is Jesus the Messiah, the Son of Man, and he writes for the Greeks. And Greeks were famous for two things. First of all, they were very historically minded. Our earliest histories that we have of ancient writings comes from Greek sources. Much of our knowledge of Egyptian history doesn't come from Egyptian records, from Greek records. And so the Greeks were very much interested in a correct chronological sequence of historical events. The second thing in the Greek culture was the concept of the ideal man, and the ideal man was the man that was fully self-disciplined, both mentally and physically, and could carry out deep thinking and can carry out great activities. The Olympic Games were innovated with that concept of the Greek mindset. And Luke is writing specifically for the Greek culture of that day to meet both kinds of needs. Look at verse 1, for example, of Luke chapter 1. For as much as many have taken the hand to draw up a narrative concerning those matters which have been fulfilled among us, even they delivered them unto us, which from the beginning were eyewitnesses. and ministers of the word that seem good to me, also having traced the course of all things accurately from the first. Notice two things he points out. That first of all, Luke himself was not an eyewitness to the events of the life of Jesus. He was not an eyewitness. He came to the Lord later in Paul's ministry. Furthermore, he also points out, secondly, there are already narratives available. There are already books out or scrolls out dealing with his life written by witnesses. So the fact that there are already eyewitness accounts available, the fact that he himself was not an eyewitness, why did he feel the necessity to put his own life of Messiah together? That comes out in verse 3, having traced the course of all things acted in the first, to write unto you in order. And the Greek word for order here is chronological order. The Greek word for order here is a chronological order. It deals with the correct sequence of historical events. And so while Matthew, Mark, and John writing their Gospels, they may not necessarily have put the material in strict chronological sequence. That was not important for them. And so while Matthew may record the event A and event C, in reality C might have come before event A. And so whenever there is a disagreement between Matthew and Luke, Mark and Luke, and John and Luke concerning the order of events, the way we follow is Luke's order, because he alone claims to put the material in chronological sequence, yet the writers made no such claim. And that's his main contribution. And A.T. Robertson largely follows Luke's order, and when he follows Luke's order, I stay with him. Now and then, as we'll see, he breaks Luke's order. When he violates the order that Luke gave us, then I go back to Luke's order and I rearrange his harmony based upon the order that Luke presents for us. And we'll see some examples of this as we proceed through the gospel events. So he writes for the historically minded Greek to give us a chronological sequence. He uses the ideal man, totally self-disciplined, both mentally and physically. He does use eyewitness accounts. He probably used both Matthew and Mark. He lived for 2 years in the land of Israel when Paul was imprisoned and would have access to eyewitness people like even Mary. As we see from his gospel, he reveals certain things that only Mary would know about. He also shows concern for 3 specific areas. First of all, he shows concern for Jerusalem. He records events about Jerusalem, the teachings of Jesus about Jerusalem that were not recorded by Matthew, Mark, or John. A second major concern is the concern for Gentiles. And he will also record things about the Gentiles that were not recorded by the other gospel writers. He came to the Lord through the ministry of the Apostle Paul. He traveled with Paul for a while. He developed Paul's concern and Paul's calling for Gentile evangelism. The third concern that he shows is a special concern for women. It will find things he records about the life of women and their role in the life of Jesus, and other elements about women that the other gospel writers chose not to record. So these are Luke's 3 main concerns: Jerusalem, Gentiles, and women. And I'll bring these out as we go through the course. Now the 4th gospel is the Gospel of John, and his theme is Jesus the Messiah, the Son of God. And as Luke emphasized the humanity of the Messiah, John emphasized the deity of the Messiah. And he writes largely for the church at large. And he has definitely an evangelistic purpose. On one hand, he shows believers all that Jesus taught, but also has an evangelistic purpose by recording the signs of Jesus to get the reader to come to believe that Jesus is that messianic person. By the time John writes his gospel, Matthew, Mark, and Luke had been written and already had a wide circulation. So his main concern is to record things that Matthew, Mark, and Luke left out. And he's far more interested in the things that Jesus said and taught than what he did. Well, Mark's gospel is far more concerned with the actions of Jesus, in keeping with the Roman mindset. The gospel of John is much more concerned with what Jesus said and taught. And in his gospel we have sermons and we have messages, we have teachings that are not found in the other three gospel accounts. Now, while the main theme of his gospel is Jesus the Messiah, the Son of God, he's got these two sub-themes to run throughout the gospel. The first sub-theme is the conflict of light and darkness. The conflict of light and darkness. This comes out several times in his gospel account. And if I was teaching only the Gospel of John, I would make more of it as we go through it. But since we're teaching the life of Messiah using all four Gospels, I will simply point out where you'll find this conflict and contrast. I will not be developing it in this course, but shall at least point out where it is. You can develop it on your own. And the second sub-theme is that he came for the purpose of teaching about the Father to humanity. He came to teach about the Father to men. And that's why John will spend more time on what he said than what he taught. And it is because of that sub-theme that John alone records the incident where a disciple asked him, "Show us the Father." And Messiah said, "You have seen me, you have seen the Father." Everything true about the divine nature of the Father is true of the Son. Therefore, to know the Son is to know the Father. And that will be a second sub-theme, the conflict of light and darkness. He came to teach about the Father to men. One more thing about John's Gospel is he likes to work around the number 7 with 3 sets of 7s. 7 signs, 7 discourses, and 7 I ams. 7 signs, 7 discourses, 7 statements of I am. I am this, I am that. And as we go through the Gospels, I'll point out what the 7 signs are, what the 7 discourses are, what the 7 I ams are. Let's go on to paragraph 2, which covers John's introduction in John chapter 1. In John chapter 1, verses 1 through 18, we have John's prologue. John's introduction is a kind of life of the Messiah. And the focus of John here is to point out the pre-existence of the Messiah. Luke's concern was the source of knowledge about the life. But John's prologue is to emphasize the pre-existence of the Messiah. He was already there before he became human. Now, verse 1, he says, "In the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God." And as many of you know, the word that he used here is the Greek word logos. Because he often used the word logos, most commentaries on John at this point go into rather lengthy dissertation to try to explain what logos meant in terms of Greek philosophy. They may take a few pages to say it, or many pages to say it. In the end, they end up saying the same thing. The Greek philosophy, the logos, had 2 concepts. And these were the concept of reason and the concept of speech. And then after letting us know that in Greek philosophy the logos had these 2 concepts of reason and speech, what these commentators try to do is to claim that what John is trying to show is how he came to fulfill the goals of Greek philosophy in both areas of reason and speech. In that by reason, he was the very idea of God, and not by speech, he was the very expression of God. Now pick up almost any commentary on John, that's essentially what you will read. But what these commentators forget is that by profession, John was not a Greek philosopher, he was a Jewish fisherman. Really has in mind not so much Greek philosophy, but Jewish theology of first century Israel. Now, because of the way the term word was used throughout the Old Testament, the rabbis began to develop a theological concept concerning the concept of the word. The Hebrew word is davar. When you see the word used in the Old Testament text, it's often personified, carrying out a commission or a mission. For example, in Genesis chapter 15, verse 1, Genesis 15:1, it's referred to as a revealer, and the word is personified as a revealer. In Psalm 33 verses 4 through 6, Psalm 33 verses 4 through 6 is the agent of creation. God spoke the word, and what he spoke would come into existence. Psalm 147 verse 15, Psalm 147 verse 15, the word moves swiftly to carry out God's purpose. Isaiah chapter 9 verse 8, Isaiah 9:8, the Lord sent the word into Jacob to accomplish a specific mission. Isaiah chapter 55 verses 10-11, Isaiah 55, 10-11 points out the word comes and goes. Isaiah 45 verse 23, Isaiah 45:23, the word goes out in righteousness. One more example is Ezekiel chapter 1 verse 3, Ezekiel 1:3, the word came expressly to the prophet. So based upon how the word was personified, the rabbis developed a concept called the memra. And the word memra is an Aramaic term. It's the Aramaic term for the Hebrew davar. In Greek, it comes out as logos. In English, it comes out as word. And so davar is Hebrew, memra is Aramaic, that became the theological term. Logos is Greek, and of course, word is English. Now, what the rabbis ended up teaching about the memra are 6 specific things. And all 6 things come out one way or another in these first 18 verses of John's Gospel. First of all, that sometimes the rabbis said the memra was distinct from God, sometimes it was the same as God. In all the writings, never tried to explain this paradox away. How is it possible for the memra, the word logos, to be distinct from God and yet be God at the same time? They simply made both statements being true and left it there, which is what John just does here in verse 1. When he says the word logos was with God, he makes him distinct from God. And then he says the word was God, making him the same as God. Like the rabbis at this stage, notice John does not try to explain the paradox away. He makes both statements being true and leaves it there for now. Unlike the rabbis, he will explain this later in terms of the triunity. The one he's writing about is distinct from God because he's not God the Father, nor is he God the Holy Spirit, but he's the same as God because he's God the Son. Only in terms of the Trinity can this rabbinic paradox finally be explained. The second thing about the memra is the agent of creation. And again, when God created anything, he did so by means of his memra, by means of his word, based upon passages like Genesis chapter 1. God will simply speak, let there be. 3 words in English, but only 1 word in Hebrew. For whatever he said, let there be, would come into existence. So everything that we see in this universe exists only because of the memra. Without the memra, nothing would exist, which now does exist. And now look at verse 3. All things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that had been made. Here he points out the same thing is true of John's Logos. Everything was made through this one. Without this one, nothing would exist, which now does exist, as he's also the agent of creation. Thirdly, he's also the agent of salvation. Whenever God saved throughout the history of the Old Testament, whether it was a physical salvation like the Exodus or a spiritual salvation of eternal life, he always saved by means of the memra, by means of the word. So again, the memra was the agent of salvation. Now look at verse 12. As men as received him, to them gave he the right to become children of God, even them that believe on his name. Here John points out that those who believe on this one, those who receive him, they're the ones to receive salvation because he is also the agent of salvation. The fourth thing about the memra is the means which God takes on visible form. Now and then in the history of the Old Testament, God took on some kind of a visible form, a visible thing. Whenever he became visible, whatever form may have been, it was by means of the memra, by means of the word. Again, it's the means which God takes on visible form. Now, in Christian theology, we call these manifestations a theophany. And when Christian writers talk about the theophany, they're referring to these visible manifestations of God's presence. The rabbis had a different term to say the same thing. The rabbinic term was Shekhinah, Shekinah, often connected with God's glory, so you find the two words coupled together, the Shekinah, glory of God. And by way of definition, the Shekinah glory is the visible manifestation of the presence of God. The visible manifestation of the presence of God. And so whenever God became visible, the invisible God became visible, whenever His omnipresence was localized, this visible localized presence was the Shekhinah, the Shekinah glory. And so most of Old Testament history came in either as a light, or fire, or cloud. Light, fire, cloud. Sometimes a combination of these three things. Whenever it came by means of the memra, by means of the word. So again, the memra is the means by which God takes on visible form. And then look at verse 14. And the Word became flesh. The Word, the Logos, that back in verse 1 was in the beginning with God, who always was God, not at a certain point of history takes on visible form. But this time what became visible was not the intangible light, fire, cloud. This time became very tangible flesh. He became human. He became man. And he says, and He dwelt among us. Now in your harmony, notice that the word dwell has the number 9 by it, and the number tells you, look at the footnote from a literal Greek rendering. And notice that what the Greek really reads is not to dwell, but to tabernacle. Literally it says the Word became flesh and tabernacled among us. Because John does not use the normal Greek word for dwelling in verse 14. He uses a totally different Greek word, which is not so much a true Greek word, but it's a parallel word to the Hebrew Shekhinah. And the meaning of it is the tabernacle. Now, when the Greeks came in contact with the Jewish world after the conquest of Alexander the Great, they came across the word Shekhinah. They liked what the word conveyed, and they wished to incorporate some of its meanings into the Greek language. The word itself was already in Greek, but it had now new connotations. But the Greek had one small problem. In Hebrew, we have one letter by which we can make the Shah sound. In English, you have to combine two letters, S and H, to make the Shah sound. In German, you have to combine 3 letters to make the Shah sound, but in Hebrew, 1 letter is sufficient. But in Greek, you cannot combine any number of letters to make the Shah sound. Greek has a hard S. They can say S. They cannot say sh. That's why Greeks are always so much noisier and louder than we Jews were and gave us headaches to our Jewish history. That story belongs to Hanukkah, which was last month, so I won't deal with it right now. What they simply do is to take the same concept, and you have the Greek word skene. And skene is simply the same as the Hebrew Shekinah with the S unhardened. For example, many of you know the word Hosanna from the New Testament. Well, Hosanna is simply the Hellenized Hebrew word Hoshana. Hoshana became Hosanna in Greek with the S unhardened, just as Shekinah became skene. As your footnote tells you in the harmony, it does not mean to dwell but to tabernacle. Because the origin of the word Shekinah goes back to the book of Exodus chapter 40. In Exodus 40, the Shekinah took its form in the cloud, took up residency within the Holy of Holies of the tabernacle. For the next several centuries, the tabernacle with the people of Israel. And it continued with the people of Israel until it finally departed from Israel in the days of Ezekiel. In Ezekiel chapters 8 through 11, Ezekiel 8 through 11 records the 4-stage departure of the Shekinah glory from Israel. And now after about 6 centuries of absence, the Shekinah has returned, not in the form of light, fire, cloud, but in the form of flesh, and once again tabernacled with the people of Israel. And like the rabbis, notice how quickly John connects this with God's glory. He goes on to say, and we beheld His glory, glory of the only begotten from the Father, full of grace and truth. Normally the Shekinah glory has a brightness about it, tends to exude light. But the physical body of the Messiah was like a veil. it veiled the brightness of his glory. When people looked upon him in first century Israel, he looked no different than any other Jewish male of first century Israel. But one time during his public ministry, the light came through, and we call the transfiguration, something we'll look at later on in our study. And the light came through the veil, affecting his clothing, making him exceptionally white. His face began to shine with the brightness of the sun, and 3 men saw the brightness of his glory. Among those 3 is the author of these words, John. And notice he words like an eyewitness, and we, me and 2 other men, we beheld his glory. And something they saw on the Mount of the Transfiguration. So just as the members of the means with which God took on visible form, the same thing happens to be true here of John's Logos. Now the 5th thing about the Memra was that the Memra was the means by which God signs his covenants. We read of 8 different covenants in the Old Testament that God makes. Now 3 of these were made with humanity in general. 5 were made specifically to the Jewish people. All were signed and sealed by the Memra, and therefore the Memra is also a covenant signer. Now verse 17 says the law was given through Moses, grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. Now the age or dispensation of the law was based upon the Mosaic covenant, signed and sealed by the Shekinah glory, back in the book of Exodus chapter 24, verses 1 through 11. Exodus 24, 1 through 11. The new age or dispensation of grace will be based upon the new covenant, which he will sign and seal by the shedding of his blood. And so when he died on the cross, he signed, he sealed, he ratified the new covenant, according to Hebrews 8 through 10, chapters 8 through 10. And therefore that makes him a covenant signer. The 6th and last thing about the Memra is also the agent of revelation. Whenever God revealed himself, he did so by means of the Memra, by means of the Word, based upon those passages that say the Word of God came to this one, the Word of the Lord came to that one. And so indeed he was also the one through whom knowledge of God came. Now verse 18 says, no man seen God any time, the only begotten Son who is in the bosom of the Father had declared him, had revealed him. And now John points out the same thing is true about his Logos. This one came to reveal the Father to men. As we pointed out earlier, that's why John has a second sub-theme. He came to reveal the nature of the Father. That's why there's more sermons and teachings here. The same point is made by Hebrews chapter 1, verses 1 through 3. Hebrews 1, 1 through 3. In the past, God revealed himself in many different ways, has in the last days revealed himself by means of the Son. He's the agent of revelation. So John's point in these 18 verses, not that he came to fulfill the goals of Greek philosophy. He came to fulfill the goals of the Messianic hope. And the 6 things rabbis were teaching about the Memra is true of Jesus of Nazareth. We can summarize what he says here in 4 simple points. First of all, the Memra, the Logos, the Word came in visible form. Secondly, sadly, the world in general did not recognize him. Thirdly, and more tragic, his own Jewish people did not recognize him either. But fourthly, those individual Jews and Gentiles who did recognize him, they became the children of the Lord, the children of God, the children of Shekinah light, and received their salvation and was the agent of salvation. Here's one example. If we get behind the Jewish frame of reference, we'll see many more of these as well. We'll see why things are written the way they're written. So now we come to Roman numeral 1, the first main division of the life of the Messiah, the introduction of the King. That covers paragraphs 3 through 27 in E.T. Robertson's Harmony. And we come to paragraph 3, which deals with the genealogy of the Messiah, as found in Matthew 1 and Luke chapter 3. Now, of the 4 gospel accounts, only 2 give us the account of the birth narratives, Matthew and Luke. Both Mark and John begin their accounts with Jesus already an adult. And because only Mark and only Matthew and Luke give us the birth narratives, would be also why they provide us with the genealogies. And genealogies deal with origins of people that were born and where they came from. Now we have these two accounts of the birth narratives that are told from two different perspectives. Matthew tells the story from Joseph's perspective, so if you read his gospel, Joseph plays the active role, Mary plays a passive role. Angels come to Joseph, not Mary, and Matthew tells us what he is thinking, not a word about what she is thinking. Luke tells the same story, but he tells it from her perspective. Everything's reversed. Mary plays the active role, Joseph plays a passive one. An angel comes to her, not to him. And Luke tells us what she is thinking, what's going on in her mind, not a word about what he is thinking. So you go by those two genealogies alone, just by the context alone. It already indicates that Matthew's genealogy is that of Joseph because he tells the story from Joseph's perspective. The genealogy of Luke is that of Mary because he tells the story from her perspective. But the question that comes up is, why do we need these two genealogies? After all, Jesus was not the biological son of Joseph anyway. So why do we need to have these two genealogies? Now the normal answer goes something like this. Matthew gives us the royal line, Luke gives us the real line. Matthew the royal line, and Luke the real line. And what they mean by that is this. That according to Matthew's account, Joseph was the heir apparent to David's throne. And because Jesus was his adopted son, Jesus could claim the throne by virtue of his being adopted by Joseph. Well, Luke provides us with the fact that he himself was biologically from David, not through a father, but only through a mother. That's the normal answer given for the two genealogies, because I will try to show the exact opposite is true. And the point of Matthew's genealogy is this. If Jesus was in any way the son of Joseph biologically, he could not be king. And nor could he be king merely by being adopted by Joseph. Look at Matthew's account. Matthew chooses to breaks with Jewish tradition, I should say, in two ways. First of all, he skips names. And he wants to have three sets of 14. And why 14? Because his focus upon the concept of Messiah being the Davidic Messianic king. And in Hebrew, David's name has numerical value of 14. The numerical value of David's name is 14. So there's three sets of 14, emphasizing that Davidic concept. A second way one way that he does follow Jewish practice is, another way that he violates Jewish practice is, he mentions the names of women. And in Jewish practice of genealogies, women were never mentioned. But he mentions 4 women, 3 by name. In verse 3, he mentions Tamar. In verse 5, Rahab and Ruth. In verse 6, the pronoun her refers to Bathsheba. Now, these were not the most significant women in the Messianic line. There were far more significant women in that line, such as Sarah, yet Sarah is not mentioned. Why are these 4 women and not some others? Well, first of all, these women were all Gentiles. He begins to hint at a point he'll make clearer later, that while the primary purpose of Messiah's coming was for the lost sheep of the house of Israel, the Gentiles will also benefit from his coming. A second thing that mention these women shows is that he came to save sinners, because 3 of these women were guilty of specific sexual sins. One was guilty of adultery, one was guilty of incest, one was guilty of prostitution. Ruth herself was not guilty of immorality, but she was the result of one because she was a Moabitess. The Moabites came because of an incest relationship between Lot and one of his daughters. So again, he hints at a point he makes clearer later. He came for the purpose of saving sinners. But again, why do we need the genealogy to begin with, since Jesus was not Joseph's biological son? Now, in verse 2, he goes as far back as Abraham because he's focusing on Jewish origins. Jewish origins begin with Abraham. So he doesn't go back to Adam, only to Abraham, where Jewish history begins. He traced the line down to verse 6, where we come to David. From David's many sons, he chooses one Solomon, and in verse 11, we read, and Josiah begat Jeconiah and his brethren at the time of the carrying away to Babylon. Jeconiah will prove crucial here. In verse 12, he picks up with Jeconiah and traces down to verse 16 to Joseph, pointing out that Joseph was a direct descendant of David through Solomon, also through Jeconiah. That being true, by the way, we already will show he could never be king. In verse 16, by the way, the word whom is a feminine, pointing out that Jesus was born only of Mary, not of Joseph, because he will then go into the virgin birth account. Now take your Bibles and turn to Jeremiah chapter 22. Now, to understand the need for two of these two genealogies, we need to remember that in the Old Testament there were two separate requirements for kingship. One was applicable to the northern kingdom of Israel, its capital in Samaria. The second was applicable only to the southern kingdom of Judah, its capital in Jerusalem. And the first requirement was to be of Davidic descent. Unless you were a member of the house of David, you had no right to sit upon the throne in Jerusalem. Anyone who tried to do so would often fail. So Isaiah chapter 7 records a conspiracy of several other kings to try to do away with the house of David and set up a new dynasty unrelated to David. In Isaiah chapter 8, God warns the people any such conspiracy will be doomed to failure and will violate the Davidic covenant, God's covenant with David. The second requirement is divine apportionment applicable to the northern kingdom with its capital in Samaria. Unless you had divine apportionment or prophetic sanction, you had no right to sit upon the throne up in Samaria, in the northern kingdom of Israel. Anyone who tried to do so ended up getting assassinated. So God told Jehu that his house, his dynasty, will last for 4 generations, and 4 men did. When the 5th one tried to gain the throne, he was assassinated. Now Jeremiah 22 verse 24, as I live, says Jehovah, though Coniah is a shortened form of the name Jeconiah, the son of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, with the signet upon my right hand, ye will pluck you thence. I will give into the hand of them that seek your life, in the hand of them of whom you are afraid, into the hand of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, into the hand of the Chaldeans. Now I will set you out, and your mother that bare you into another country, where you were not born, there you shall die. For the land whereon your soul longs to return, there you shall not return. Is this man Coniah a despised broken vessel? Is he a vessel where none delight? Wherefore are they cast out, he and his seed, and they cast into land which they knew not? O earth, 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 hear the word of Jehovah. Thus says Jehovah, write ye this man childless, a man that shall not prosper in his days, for no more shall a man of his seed prosper, sitting upon the throne of David, in Judah. Because the kind of man that Jeconiah was, God placed a special curse upon him, and the curse grows in its intensity. He'll go into captivity, he'll die in captivity, never to return to his homeland again. When that high point is reached in verse 29, God calls upon the whole earth 3 times over to listen to what the high point is. The high point is spelled out in verse 30, that no descendant of Jeconiah will ever have the right to sit upon the throne of David. No descendant of Jeconiah has the right to sit upon David's throne. So until this point of Jeremiah 22, the first requirement was to be the house of David. It was now further limited. You still have to be a member of the house of David, but now apart from Jeconiah. Apart from Jeconiah. All of this will play a role in how Jesus could claim the throne of David. Now going back to our gospel account and the genealogies, we learned previously is that Joseph was a descendant of David through Jeconiah, and based upon Jeremiah's curse, that meant that he was not the heir apparent to David's throne. If Jesus was the real son of Joseph, biologically, he too would be disqualified from sitting upon the throne of David. And because Matthew is writing to a Jewish audience that would know about the Jeconiah curse, he presents the curse problem. He solves it by the account of the virgin birth. Luke does not have a Jeconiah problem. So he reverses it. He starts out with the virgin birth account. The genealogy comes up only at the end of chapter 3 of his gospel. Now this background, let's go over to Luke's account. Luke chapter 3, verses 23 to 38. You have Luke's account. And because Luke is focusing on humanity, and because humanity begins with Adam, he traces the genealogy all the way back to Adam. But unlike Matthew, Luke follows strict Jewish procedures in that he does not skip any names, nor does he mention names of any women. Now, if by Jewish law you could not mention the name of a woman, the question would then be, suppose you want to trace a woman's line, how do you do that? And the answer is you would substitute her name with her husband's name. There is a second question. If the husband's name appears both in his own genealogy and her genealogy, how could someone tell the difference? How could you tell which one is which? Because in both cases, Joseph's name will appear. And the problem lies in the point of English grammar, because it does not exist in the Greek. We do not use a definite article before a proper name. We don't say the Susan, we don't say the Larry, we don't use a definite article with a proper name in English. But in Greek it's quite permissible. And never a single name in this list has definite article in front of it, with one exception. And the exception is in verse 24, where Joseph's name does not have a definite article. And now I would tell the original reader that although this is Joseph's name, this is not really his line, it's a line of his wife, but in keeping with the Jewish practice, it is his name that is used. If you want more details on this, there's an appendix in the back of the Harmony on pages 259 till 262. 259 till 262 in the back of Robertson's Harmony, and it gives you a more detailed explanation as to how that system works. But notice that in end of verse 23, first part of verse 24, he calls Joseph the son of Heli. In Talmudic literature, rabbinic writings, whenever they refer to Mary by her Jewish name Miriam, they call her the daughter of Heli. The daughter of Heli. Rabbis recognized that this was not really Joseph's line, it was her line. And the substitution for a husband's name for the wife you'll also find in two places in the Old Testament, Ezra chapter 2 verse 61, Ezra 2:61, also Nehemiah chapter 7 verse 63, Nehemiah 7 verse 63. Now whereas Matthew went back into time and came into his own day, Luke doesn't reverse thought. He begins with his own time, works back into history all the way back to Adam. Now look at verse 31. Verse 31, he says, the son of Eliakim, the son of Malaiah, the son of Menah, the son of Methathram, the son of Nathan, the son of David. What we learned then here is that Mary, like Joseph, was also from the house of David. However, she came one of David's other sons, not Solomon and therefore Jeconiah, but through Nathan. And therefore she was a member of the house of David apart from Jeconiah. And because Jesus was her biological son, that meant he also was a descendant of David apart from Jeconiah. And therefore he fulfills the first requirement. He was a member of the house of David apart from Jeconiah. The trouble is he was not the only one. At this point of Jewish history, there are many other Jews living. They're also members of the house of David apart from Jeconiah. Why does he have the right to claim the throne, not somebody else? That's because of the second requirement of divine appointment that we'll see a little bit later this evening. We get to paragraph 5. Now, the early paragraphs of the life of the Messiah keep referring back to various Jewish covenants that God made with the Jewish people. And look at Matthew chapter 1, verse 1. By calling him the son of David, connects him with the Davidic covenant. And calling the son of Abraham connects him with the Abrahamic covenant. And because of these connections, as he will be the one to fulfill the Jewish covenants for Israel. Also, within genealogies, you have the four sonships of the Messiah. The first sonship is the son of David, and that means that Jesus is a king. More specifically, the Messianic king. Son of Abraham, Jesus is a Jew. At the end of Luke's version, Luke chapter 3, verse 38, two more sonships. The son of man, or Adam, meaning he is human. And then the Son of God, he is God. You put the four sonships together, son of David, Abraham, Adam, and God. Put it together, you have the Messianic Jewish God-man king. The Messianic Jewish God-man king. Now, point 2 in your outline, we have the advent of the king comprising paragraphs 4 through 11, with paragraph 4 being the annunciation of the birth of John to Zacharias in Luke chapter 1. There are two key people in this paragraph. First person is Zechariah, and Zechariah in Hebrew means Jehovah remembers. Jehovah remembers. Elizabeth in Hebrew Elisheva, which means the oath of God, the oath of God. And you put the two names together, God remembers his oath. God remembers his oath, again a covenantal connection. And later on, not in this paragraph, but in paragraph 5, I believe, there'll be, not 5, but in paragraph 8, there'll be a play upon words of the meanings of these two names. I'll come back to it at that point. Now, verse 5 points out that he was a member of the order of the course of Abijah. Now, when David divided the tribe of Levi in 1 Chronicles 24, he divided the priesthood into 24 courses, and every course would have a 2-week turn in the daily cure functions of the temple compound. And so after 2 weeks, the one course left, the new course would come in, and so on. And each course had many different priests. And who did what was chosen by the casting of lots. And that was practiced in the first century. So you still only had one high priest. Under the high priest, you had 24 chief priests in charge of 24 courses. And then you had many common priests. And Zechariah was one of the many common priests of the course of Abijah. We read in verse 6 that both he and his wife were righteous before God. They were members of the believing remnant of that day, walking all the commandments, ordinances of the Lord blameless. The word blameless does not mean perfect sinlessly. They were blameless in that when they did sin, they brought the proper sacrifices and had those sins covered. In that sense, they were blameless, not sinless, but blameless. Now, his function for a 2-week period is to perform the same ceremony, the burning of the incense. It was a relatively simple ceremony. You would take a hot coal, an altar of sacrifice. You burn the first room, but there was a second altar from the thick curtain, altar of incense. You put the hot coals upon the altar, rub incense to become a sweet-smelling smoke, odor offering before the Lord into the Holy of Holies. And that's his function for 2 weeks, twice a day, morning and evening. Now, because what happened back in Leviticus chapter 10, Leviticus 10, when the two sons of Aaron performed the same ceremony improperly, were stricken dead by God in the holy place. The common teaching of first century Judaism was this: if any priest made a mistake, he too would die in the holy place. That's the background to verse 11. And appeared to him an angel of the Lord standing on the right side of the altar of incense. Now, by first century Judaism, the rabbis had embellished the teaching a bit. They want to say that if a priest were made a mistake and was going to die, before he would die, an angel would visibly appear standing, not on the left side, but specifically on the right side of the altar of incense. And that would be the angel of death. So if they saw an angel standing on the right side of the altar of incense, the priest should assume they made a mistake and should assume he would soon die. As we look at verse, so while he's doing the incense burning, what happens? An angel appears standing on the right side of the altar of incense. Look at verse 12. And Zechariah was troubled. Guess why? What happened? He expects to die, but the message of the angel will not be a message of judgment or death, but of new life and blessing to come. When he tells Zechariah, in spite of his age, he will sire a son. And in verse 13, when that son is born, he should name him John. That's a very anglicized form of the name. His name in Hebrew was Yochanan. And Yochanan means Jehovah is gracious, or the grace of Jehovah. Jehovah is gracious, or the grace of Jehovah. That is the actual meaning of the name. And with his name, he's announcing the coming of a new age, a new dispensation. And he says several things about John. First of all, he shall be great in the sight of the Lord. That'll be John's position before the Lord, one of greatness. How great he was ending up going to be, we'll see, because of how Jesus will evaluate him a bit later. Secondly, he shall drink no wine, nor strong drink. He must totally abstain from anything having to do with alcohol, anything from the grape. Now, he was not told to abstain from wine because he was John the Baptist. That's not the reason. Rather, it was to be a Nazarite from birth. Now, generally speaking, the Nazarite vow was a voluntary vow one took for a set period of time. But three people in biblical history were called to be Nazarites from birth. First of all, Samson, who was unfaithful to his vow. Secondly, Samuel, who was faithful to his vow. They have a third person, Yochanan, John. That's the reason for total abstention. Thirdly, he shall be filled with the Holy Spirit from his mother's womb. To be filled means to be controlled by the Spirit. He'll be with Spirit's control even when he's still in the womb of his mother. Fourthly, many of the children of Israel shall he turn unto Lord their God. He'll begin a repentance movement, a back to God movement, to get the people ready, have a group ready to accept the Messiah once he identifies who the Messiah will be. Fifthly, he shall go before his face in the spirit and power of Elijah. And we'll see several correlations between John and Elijah throughout the Gospels. This is the first one. He'll come in the same power and spirit as Elijah the prophet. And like Elijah, he'll have a special ministry to the believing remnant of that day. And finally, end of verse 17, to make a people ready for the Lord, for him. His purpose to have a group ready to accept him as Jesus the Messiah, what John clearly identifies who the Messiah is going to be. So here Zechariah has been given some tremendous good news. But he finally is able to speak in verse 18, whereby shall I know this from an old man, and my wife is stricken in years. He raises a question, how can I know that this is true? It's a question which arises out of unbelief. And so the angel gives him a rather unique sign. Since he spoke a word of a question of unbelief, he will speak no more until the promise is fulfilled. And now he's stricken to be a mute. He'll stay a mute until the day that John is circumcised. When you're having a conversation with an angel, that takes some time, much longer time than it takes to burn some incense on the hot coals. And people outside in verse 21 were waiting for him, wondering why it was taking so long. Eventually he came out, but he can't speak anymore, could tell them nothing of what happened to him inside. And people recognize something happened, but they cannot know what happened. But when he finished his 2-week course of actions in verses 24 and 25, he He returned to his wife, and shortly thereafter she conceives. And now she hides herself for 5 months, saying, the Lord has taken away my reproach, because in biblical times there was nothing more negative than a barren woman who could not produce children. Not such a terrible thing nowadays, but it was considered a very terrible thing in biblical times, because it was cutting off the husband's line. And now that reproach had been taken away, that she was pregnant. All right, it's almost 8 o'clock. Let's go ahead and take our break, and we'll pick it up at 8:15. The harmonies are at the table back there. If you'd like to use one of these, it'll be helpful. And I think there's coffee and tea and goodies way in the back.